Hey, let's do a walkthrough of using the archinstall script. By the end of the video, you'll be comfortable going through most of the options to set up an Arch Linux-based system however you see fit. If you want to use my niri-based dotfiles in the end, you can one-shot them. If you want to use something else, that's totally cool, because we're going to be focusing just on that archinstall script. So with that said, if you plan to follow along here, my dotfiles do have instructions on how to set up a bootable USB drive. That's independent of whether or not you use the dotfiles, but I'll link to this in the description if you go and want to check it out here, because you will need to do that if you're going to be booting up from a USB stick, which is where we're kind of going to kick off this video from. With that said, I am going to be recording all of this through a VM that I'm about to kick off here. But, once I begin this installation here, it is going to be what you see is what you get on your end too, if you were to boot up from that USB stick. Let me kick this things off here. We're going to create a new VM. In my case, you're going to be booting from the USB drive. Now, when you first boot up, you will see a screen like this. And I'm going to choose the option on top there by hitting enter. Now things are booting up as expected here. Eventually we are going to reach the archinstall prompt here. There it is. Now here's something to think about. On my machine here, I am using a wired Ethernet device here, but if you're using Wi-Fi, you'll need to run some extra little steps here to do that. So for example, I can't really demonstrate them because I don't even have a Wi-Fi card or anything hooked up here, but the instructions here up top say to, authenticate with your Wi-Fi network. You can run, IWCTL here, and then here, in this case, you can do, I believe it is device list. In my case, I have no devices here. But the good news is, if I go and check out the documentation here that I wrote here, this will walk you through what you need to do here. So you might want to pause the video just to do these steps here. You can do that device list here, assuming you probably have like, WLAN 0 or something like that. Then you can like scan for your networks. You can list, networks here. You can then connect to it, put in your password, and then exit, and you'll be good to go here. You might want to verify by running something like ping.example.com, Control-C to stop that, and then you're in business here. And now we can both follow along from the same spot here. And basically we just need to run the archinstall script here, which we can just do by exiting first the IWCTL thing. All right, so now we're all on the clean slate here. All I've done here was just maximize the VM here, cleared the screen just to give us a little bit more space. But yeah, we can just run archinstall now to get things going. So this is going to kick off the archinstaller. Cool, so here we are in the archinstall script, and we can all follow along together with the same steps. And of course, if you have different opinions than me, you can make some changes along the way. So let's just start from the top here, picking your language. In my case, I am using English here. You can use the up and down arrows to pick a different language. You can hit enter over the one that you want. Notice on the bottom here, there are a couple of hotkeys that we can choose. For example, hit escape, or you can do a search with the / etc., because the list here is pretty big. So in this case here, I'm going to choose English by hitting enter, and then we're good to go. When it comes to the locales, we have a couple of different options here. Even on my main system outside the VM, it just picked all the things I wanted to use anyways, but let's go in there and take a look here. So for example, for the keyboard layout, you can hit enter to change that. If you want to choose something else, again, I'm going to go with US here. And then same thing for the locale here. US UTF-8 makes sense for my machine here. Might be a little bit different for yours if you want a different language. So feel free to find whatever you want in the list here. And then, you can just pick it here. And then for the encoding, if you want to choose something different than UTF-8, you can also choose that here as well. But let's go with UTF-8 here. And then we'll go back. And then we can choose a mirror. So in this case here, we can just select the region where we live here. And in my case here, I live in the US, so I'll just go scrolling down here all the way to the US here. And of course, this list wraps around, so you can go from the bottom here as well. In this case here, going back to some of those shortcuts on the bottom, you can hit the space bar here to toggle it. Notice there is an X there, now it's off, now it's on, etc. You can also search using / as well, if you wanted to do a search for Poland or something like that. But in any case here, let's go back to where we were before to, United States here, hit enter, it's selected, cool. Again, change that as needed here. We don't really need to mess around with custom servers unless you have a real good use case for it. So we can go back from here. And then, now let's talk a little bit about disk configuration, because, this is definitely going to be an interesting one. And in my case here, I have a couple of different hard drives. I have an SSD and then also, a spinning disk drive as well. And, I didn't plan to dual boot, or I have no plans to do that. So what I ended up doing was just taking my SSD, which is 256 gigs, and just making that a single default partition layout here using this top option. What that means is everything on that SSD was wiped, and the archinstall script is going to handle setting up a boot partition for you, as well as your root partition. And then within that root partition, is the entire archinstall, as well as your home directory. Now, this might be something you're thinking about. It's like, well, should I partition my drive to have the home directory being on a separate partition? I don't know, maybe yes or no. And in my opinion, I've set up all sorts of different systems over the years, Windows and now Linux, and it's like, I've gone down that path of setting up a separate partition for the home directory, and almost every single scenario, I'm like, I wish I didn't, because, you know, things change over time based on your size expectations, right? It's like, it forces you to kind of balance your file system before you even know what you're going to put on there. Like, how big should your Arch Linux partition be? Should it be 30 gigs? What about like 50? Because maybe you install a lot of things. I just find it a lot easier just to have a single partition there for the root partition and your home directory, because, you know, there are ways to handle this in a dynamic way, right? You can use LVM, you can use btrfs, you can, you know, all sorts of different things. But even if you were to hose your complete Arch installation here and you need to reinstall it, there's quite a few different ways to do that without affecting your home directory. So yeah, in any case here though, if you want to dual boot, you'll need to go through manual partitioning here. We're not going to go over that in the video here. We're going to go over the default option here, which is going to wipe this entire disk, and then the archinstall script is going to handle the rest for you. With that said, if you have multiple hard drives in your machine right now, you will very likely see multiple disks here. So, you know, in the middle there, we have that size. Just make sure you're operating on the correct one. That's going to be really, really important here. The model on the first column there will give you some hints as well. So just hit the space bar to, you know, add that X there. Again, on the bottom there's some hotkeys. But yeah, just make sure you're operating on the right one, because this will get formatted. It's not going to get formatted right now. So we're going to go through all the options at the very end. And then after you do a confirmation, then the Arch Linux install script is going to do it. So yeah, you can always go back here and modify this, you know, even if you have second doubts a little bit later. So in any case though, yeah, let's choose that one here. Cool. And then, yeah, another choice here, right, for the file system. What do we want to do? btrfs or maybe ext4 or something else. And I would suggest using ext4. It's what I use on my main system. You know, it's battle hardened. And I don't know, it seems like, well, what about snapshots? Because that's really one really nice thing about btrfs, right? This idea of like, okay, maybe you do an Arch update here on your system and everything gets messed up and you need to roll back to a snapshot. In my opinion, I don't know, there's a lot of different ways to handle this. One, just having really good backups of the things that you care about is really important, independent of whatever file system that you choose. For example, you know, all of my data and home directory stuff and all that is just backed up to an external drive. If my system were to get completely hosed, it's like, I mean, I would care, but like at the same time, like, you know, like I just reinstall Arch Linux and then just restore from my backup and I'm up and running in about 15 minutes. It's not really a big deal. And then you also have to think too, like, what are you optimizing for? Because this idea of your system becoming completely bricked, like that is a really, really big edge case, right? The odds of that happening are really low. And let's just say that you were a maniac and you did a really big system update after a long time. You didn't read the Arch news, which will let you know about some maybe changes you need to make or incompatibilities. Then it's like, well, okay, that's pretty bad. But then it's like, okay, I'll just restore from my backups and I'm back in business. So it's like, if that were to happen every 2 years, like maybe one time, then yeah, you could just do that. And also it's kind of interesting too, because there are ways to install Arch Linux where even if you had no backups, let's say, and you had one single partition for your root partition as well as your home directory being in there, you can still install Arch Linux in such a way where you can recreate the entire, you know, base Arch installation without modifying your home directory. So even then, like you can technically, you know, get things going and running there with a reinstall of Arch, even on a single drive with no backups. And, you know, again, I wouldn't suggest doing that because having backups are good. But all this to say, yeah, I mean, ext4 feels like a good choice even in 2026 and beyond. So I'm going to roll with that. Again, if you really want to use btrfs, there's nothing about this that will be incompatible. It's just like you'll be using that instead. So it's no big deal. So let's go and choose that here. And then, yeah, when it comes to the partitioning here, we don't really need to change a whole lot. This is just the Arch install script letting you know, like, hey, by the way, I'm going to set up a boot partition here as well as your main drive. You know, it creates that 1 gig line item on the top there. You know, I actually don't have a mouse to move around to point, but yeah, there we go. And when it comes to LVM, like we really don't need to set that up in my opinion. If you want to go and Google around, the Arch Wiki has a lot more details there. But again, you know, if we're just sticking with having the root partition handle the system data and the home directory and all that stuff, there's no real use case to use that in my opinion here. But yeah, again, depending on how your drives are set up, maybe it makes sense for you. Now, when it comes to encryption, it will be disabled by default here, but I would suggest or highly suggest here enabling encryption. You know, whether or not you have a laptop or a desktop, I think it's both the same. You know, the idea here, at least in the laptop case, right? Like maybe it gets stolen or something like that. Having your entire disk encrypted is really nice because you can be pretty confident that Nobody's going to get inside the contents of that. Even if you have a desktop, it's still really good in my opinion here, just to have things super locked down. You're in complete control of all the contents of your disk, and it's going to be tucked away behind a passphrase that only you know. So let's go with that. Again, if you don't want to use encryption, that's completely fine, but we'll use Luke's here, which is, just a complete standard here on Linux. So with that said, let's go through some of the options here. Again, we're going to go with Luke's here. You can, add your encryption password here, which is going to be really, I can't stress this enough. It is really, really important that you do not forget this password. I would suggest writing it down on a piece of paper in handwriting that you'll be able to understand 3 days from now or 3 years from now, directly after inputting it here. And we're going to be able to just set things up to also confirm this. So, in case you make a typo here, it's no biggie. In my case here, I'm just going to put in a password of pass, which is definitely not a good idea. It's even telling me it's pretty weak here and not a good idea, but I'm going to do it anyways because, I'm just going to be throwing this VM away anyways at the end. But yeah, there it is here. Cool. Iteration time, we can just leave this at 10,000 milliseconds here. And so let's go back to here and all right, go back again, and then nice. So we have basically the hard part, right? These are like decision points, like, oh, do I want to have this file system or that, or encryption, or things like this. Okay, cool. So when it comes to the swap here, we could just also keep this one at the default here, which is going to be just setting things up here to have ZRAM, which is pretty nice here. We don't really need to click through these. I just wanted to show you them. But yeah, we'll just go with the defaults here. I just hit enter, enter. Cool. And then when it comes to the bootloader, this one is pretty interesting. So let's go to the bootloader here and take a look. And well, this is where things will get a little bit different. And I am using a VM here. And even with the VM configured to use UEFI or have a UEFI compatible BIOS, I guess you could say, it doesn't let me choose systemd from here because it looks like it's not detected, and I don't really know how to resolve that at a VM level. It's not really super important, but you will see one more option here for systemd boot, and that's actually what I would suggest using. So I have that on my main machine, I have that on a laptop also running, and yeah, it's super solid. Arch Linux uses systemd for quite a lot of things. In my opinion, it makes sense to use that for booting up as well. It's one less dependency to worry about, versus the options that you see here. I'm going to choose grub here just because it's the only real option. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's, a option to choose here, but yeah, in your side, systemd boot. So I'm going to choose grub, just again, because I'm in the VM here. And when it comes to picking a Linux kernel, by default, it's just going to be the standard Linux kernel that you get. But if you want to use like LTS or hardened or something else, you can choose those as well. You can even have, multiple kernels if you want. But I would suggest just sticking with the standard here unless you have a good reason to use something else. So let's roll with that one. You can see Linux there is selected by default. And then for the host name, this is always fun, right? You can choose this based on whatever preferences that you have. I'm going to leave it as Arch Linux. There's a million ways to name your host here. Maybe it's your desktop or laptop, or maybe have some cool code names or something like that. It's really up to you. You can always change this later. It's not a big deal. Let's go to authentication now. And yeah, we'll set up a root password, which is going to be pass in my case, which is a horrible password, but let's go with that. And then, yeah, user account here, which will be nice. You want to add a user here. This will be the main user that you're logging in as into your system. So, I'm going to choose Nick here and also use a password of password. We're actually just pass there. Again, choose something better here. We do want this Nick user or whatever user that you make to be a super user. So it can use sudo, etc. So let's roll with that one. Definitely a good idea here. And yeah, you can always add new users later, but for now, let's just stick with the one user that we have, which is going to be the user that we're going to be logging in as. So now we can just confirm and exit here with enter. Now, when it comes to UTF here, this is one of those need to know bases here. If you don't need to set it up, then don't worry about it. If you do, then feel free to set it up. Then when it comes to the profile, so this is where things start to get a little bit interesting. So if we go to the type here, if you plan to use my .files, then you will not want to choose anything here because my .files install all the different environment stuff up for you, niri and all sorts of different packages. But if you don't plan to use my .files and you want to use something else, then, you might want to pick maybe desktop or minimal. You might want to choose nothing. If you want to set up everything by hand by yourself, you might want to choose minimal, pick through a couple of different things. You might want to go to something like desktop, and then let's see what you have. So here, you can choose to, there's niri here, there's like KDE somewhere in the list here, Plasma there, Hyperland, GNOME, like whatever you want, you can do this. But this is really just a shortcut to install a couple of different packages for you. And actually, if you go through some of the lists here, you'll see what's going to be installed for you. So like that Plasma meta package, it's going to do that for you with niri. There's a couple of different ones here. But again, this is already making quite a few opinions here. Like, do you want to use Fuzzle and, Alacrity for your terminal and Mako for notifications and all that stuff here? If you have different opinions, maybe you wouldn't choose niri here, and then you can install something different if you want something different. Like maybe you want Ghosty instead of Alacrity or whatever. But these are meant to be, just things to kickstart you, right? Get things up and running in a quick way. But in this case here, I'm going to hit escape here because I'm not going to be installing any of these here. But again, it's really up to you if you want to, install KDE Plasma or something. It can't hurt to do that if that's what you want to do. So let's go back to back here, because in this case here, I'm not going to choose to do anything here. So let's go to applications here. If you have Bluetooth, which I don't have connected here or set up, you could hit no here as well. Again, if you plan to use my .files, all of this is going to be configured for you. You don't need to select anything. But if you don't plan to use my .files, then yeah, you will want to configure Bluetooth here if you have it. I'm going to hit no here just because I don't have that capability. Again, with audio, I feel like I'm going to be repeating this line a lot. If you're using my .files, you don't need to select anything because it will install everything for you. But if you want to choose things manually, you're not using my .files, then yeah, using Pipewire would be a really good idea here. It's a modern way to deal with audio on a Linux-based system. So I would highly, highly suggest doing that unless you have a really good reason not to. So I'm actually going to go with no audio server here because yeah, .files will set that up. So when it comes to print service, that's actually one spot where my .files don't set anything up. So if you do have a printer and you want the print service enabled, then you'll want to set that up. I actually don't even have a printer. And then, yeah, firewall here, you can just skip it. Basically, .files will set all the stuff up for you. So feel free to deal with that. I like using IP tables anyways, so I wouldn't use either choices on this list here as they're presented. So then when additional fonts, again, it's really up to you. All the stuff you can install later on your own. There's nothing special about the archinstall script saying, hey, this package is going to be installed only now. You're always going to have an opportunity to install stuff later. But yeah, let's just go over the menu here. There's a whole bunch of different fonts. .files will handle this for you again if you're using them. If not, you might want to install some of these things like Notafonts is a pretty reasonable idea. But again, you can always install that later as needed. So let's go back to back here, or back and use the back menu. And then yeah, network configuration. Let's go with the copy ISO network configuration to installation. Basically what this means is, all the network configuration that's been done during the Arch install, then that's going to be carried over to your system here, which is almost likely the case in pretty much all cases. But again, if you have a reason to use something different, like manual configuration, that's totally fine as well. But yeah, let's choose the top option here. And then when it comes to Pacman, you can just configure Pacman however you see it fit here, with some, color true, etc. The .files will set all the stuff up for you if you want. But yeah, by default there, sure, color true sounds pretty nice because it makes it a little bit easier to skim. Additional packages, again, if you're using my .files, all the stuff will be installed for you. Don't need to install anything. However, if you want to take a look here at some, extra packages that are available, you can kickstart your system here by installing all sorts of different things if you'd like. This is where using search, the / there is pretty handy, because if you wanted to install something like NeoVim, then you totally could just like that, where maybe you want to install something else. Again, you can always install these afterwards on the command line, but if you have a whole bunch of different tools that you want to install, feel free to install them if you're not using my .files. Otherwise, yeah, .files will handle all that. So I'm going to escape out of here. And then, yeah, go to the time zone. We're almost done, by the way. In this case here, it is going to be UTC by default. But again, depending on where you live in the world, setting the time zone to your system seems like a pretty reasonable idea. So I'm actually going to use the search here. I'm in America, New York here, so I'm going to choose that one. But again, feel free to choose whatever one you like here that makes sense for your system. So I'm going to hit enter over that one. And then, yeah, automatic time sync. So yeah, we totally want this. We want to keep our time in sync, using the systemd's time sync D or whatever service it's running here behind the scenes, which is pretty nice to have. We don't need to worry about manually syncing our time. So let's roll with that. Now, this is where things get pretty fun because this is where you kind of kick off everything, right? So let's go to install here. But, an important aside here is, if you did want to save this configuration here, it basically is a JSON file that you can then load on a different machine or at another time. That could be interesting, but for now, let's go with install here. If you wanted to back out of anything, you can also abort this. If you wanted to go back here and change things around here, you can totally do that too. But yeah, let's go with install. And again, we'll have the opportunity to review some of the things here. But if that looks all good here, be very, very super sure that you are operating on the correct drive here. That is very, very, very important here. So yeah, I hit tab, by the way, just to move down to the bottom. Now I'm using the arrow keys. So if you want to review the drive information here that's going to be set up, then yeah, you can totally do that. I'm going to hit tab again to go back to the menus up top here. Let's go and continue. And here we go. This is where things are going to get kicked off. The Arch install script, all that configuration that we did is now going to be implemented. And, this is kind of the value of the archinstall script, right? Where you could totally go to the Arch wiki or some other source and run all of these individual commands in sequence to set up your system by hand. But the archinstall script is going to do those things for you. And it's a really cool thing because it's not like reducing the complexity to zero. Like we still had to make quite a few different choices here during the installation. And but the benefit here is we don't need to memorize, 30 different commands to run or whatever it is. But if we want to know more about those commands, like the Arch wiki will break down like what you would need to do on your system to run them manually. So with that said, now we're just waiting here on some networking stuff. It looks like, I'm just reading that last line here. It might take a while here just to do some tests to see which mirror is going to be best because, we will be installing quite a few different packages here through whatever the Arch installer is going to set up here. So yeah, there we go. So now it's going to rip through this on my main system, which was built in 2014. So we're already dealing with like a 12-year-old system here. The entire Arch install setup here that we just is running right now, this finished in about 1 minute and like 45 seconds. Now I am in a VM here where I only allocated it like 4 gigs of memory and 2 CPU cores. So it may take a little bit longer, but yeah, my main machine, by the way, is like 4 CPU cores. So, double the cores. It won't be twice as fast because a lot of this is network bound anyways, but yeah, maybe it finishes a lot faster on your machine. Maybe it's a little bit slower. Now, with that said, I wonder how long I can ramble here to see if I can ramble just long enough to have this thing completely finished without needing to pause the video. But I could also pause the video here, and when everything is done, then we'll be able to resume together. But yeah, it's pretty fun though, just watching the archinstall script go through all of this here. Now it's actually installing quite a different packages here. In this case here, we could see grub install stuff is being installed, but if you chose systemd, then you wouldn't see this output here. Now it's setting all sorts of different things up, and there it goes. 2 minutes and 17 seconds. Not bad for a dinky little VM here. So in this case here, we can reboot the system. We can go to exit the Arch install here. So we could do this. And then at this point in time, now you can actually disconnect your USB drive, and then you can just do a reboot here. And yeah, then you'll be rebooted into the bootloader that you chose, like let's say systemd, and you'll be able to boot into Arch Linux. So I'm going to reboot right now on the VM. And, this should emulate what would happen on your system as well. So in this case here it is. This is the grub boot menu, a little bit different than systemd, but basically same principle here. You can just hit enter on this thing, and this should now boot you into being able to put in your disk encryption password. Well, for some reason, maybe you know what? So this is pretty interesting. Maybe I actually didn't enable disk encryption by accident. Maybe it wasn't selected, because normally you'd be prompted for your password now to decrypt your drive. But no biggie, just put in your password to decrypt your drive. And now we're logging in. So I'm going to log in with username Nick, and then my password of pass. And then here we go. We have Arch Linux. So let me go back to full screen just so it's maybe a little bit easier to focus on stuff. So yeah, now you have a base system for you to set up things however you'd like. Now, if you wanted to use my .files here, in this install script here, or actually going all the way back down to here, all these different steps that we just went over now on video are actually written out. So in case the Arch install script does change over time, these bullet points will be updated as needed. But usually, when the Arch install script gets updated, a lot of times it's kind of just like changing the order of things or slight tweaks that you'll be able to get the gist of it. But anyways, we went through all these different steps here, and now if you were to want to install my .files, you can just go to the install section here, just run this straight up in your installation that we just booted into. And then, yeah, 10, 15 minutes, however long it takes later, you'll be good to go here. Maybe I'll do a future video on that one because that's a whole different topic. But yeah, literally just run this command here, hit yes a couple of times, sit back and relax, and you'll be booting into the exact environment that I have here using Niri. But feel free to check that one out if you like. With that said, if you have any questions about this process, or not just my .files, but I mean installing Arch Linux, let us know in the comments below. And if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. It really does help a lot. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.